Hello, everybody. This is Reality Trip. I'm your host, Ben Fama Jr. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. If this is your first time on the podcast, make sure that you like, make sure that you subscribe. And if you're watching us on the live chat, make sure you leave your comments and your questions. And of course, you can catch the replay on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and our audio on iTunes and Stitcher. So first off, hope everyone had a really great New Year. Hope everyone had a really great Christmas. We're returning back from our break, and I'm bringing back my next guest, who's actually one of the most popular people I've actually had on my shows. I've been doing this for almost 4 years now, and probably the most viewed and most download is my next guest coming up. So I'm really happy to bring him back on the show today. So, but let's get into it. I'm not going to waste any more time. My next guest is an American historian, atheist activist, author, public speaker, and blogger. He has a doctorate in ancient history from Columbia University, where his thesis was on the history of science in antiquity. He originally gained prominence as an advocate of atheism and metaphysical naturalism, authoring many articles on the secular web, and later defended his basic position in his book, Sense and Goodness Without God. His latest book is The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. So please help me welcome back to the show, Dr. Richard Carrier. Richard, how you doing today, buddy?
Hello, doing well, actually.
Glad to have you back, man. I'm glad you're joining us on the show today.
Yeah, good to be here.
So, you know, I wanted to bring you on the show because I had the opportunity to watch a debate at MythCon, and maybe you can catch us up to speed about this. And this debate that you actually had about social justice and intersecting with atheism. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about this because I was a little bit disappointed on how the debate ended up and some of the arguments that were coming from your debate with Sargon of Akkad, which I really was truly, I'm just going to leave this out here right now. It was fucking embarrassing to listen to the debate. But I think you brought up some really, really great points. And I thought maybe we can go into depth about why you brought some of these points up. So before we get started, can you talk about the debate? Talk about what you guys were supposed to be discussing and how this all came about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long backstory, of course, but the basic gist of it was Sargon of Akkad is pretty much on YouTube the most subscribed advocate of a particular stance in atheism, which is anti-social justice, anti-feminism, and I take the opposite stance on that. Now, in reality, of course, I take a moderate position, and Sargon is dividing the world into like feminist extremists on the one hand, and like really stupid social justice activism, and then being against all of it. Whereas my position is you got to find the Aristotelian mean, right? Find the middle ground. And when you look at the facts and set aside the binary, like black and white stuff, there are actually some things about social justice and feminism that we do need to be adopting as a society, which means if atheists want to build a better society without religion, we got to pay attention to these things and start integrating them and doing it critically and smartly.
Yeah, and I think that's why I thought it was super important. It's not that I discredit some of the criticism that comes to the far left. There's been many people I've had on this program. I've been very outspoken about some of the far left fringes and stuff. I think the problem is he kept making like that was the whole generalization of the whole entire platform, and I feel like we're just debating like a religious argument there.
Yeah, it is because he and I both agree, at least on certain aspects of this extremist positions. I think there's a lot of like pseudoscience on the left. There's a lot of error on the left. There's a lot of fallacies on the left. There's a lot of the same kind of oppressive thinking that you find on the right, actually. So that does happen. I blogged about this repeatedly. So people who want to go read about this, I've written many blogs about this fact, and especially in regard to the debates with Sargon. You can actually search my web at richardcarrier.info. It's .info. You could go there. Just search Sargon, all the relevant stuff will come up. And so I think, there's valid criticism there, but there's also valid criticism for conservative and what people will call moderate positions, but they're not really. I call them status quoist positions. They're still anti-progressivism. And so I think there's validity on both sides, and we have to actually sort out the dust rather than basing it on ideology and your mythologies. actually just examine the facts and say, well, what does wash out in the end once you get rid of all of the error and speculation and stuff? What's left over? What's left over is, in my opinion, not what Sargon of Akkad is advocating. And so that was what our actual difference was. But he wanted to argue against the extremists, but I already agree with him on that. So there wasn't anything to debate there. And it was worse than that, because it wasn't just that we were talking past each other, which didn't make sense because we had planned in advance. We talked about this, like what we would talk about and stuff by email and things like that. So he knew my positions. So it's not like he acted like he was surprised by this. He couldn't have been surprised by this. But the other thing was, like, he was just right out of the gate super aggressive and bullying and mean, which this was supposed to be an opportunity for him to show that he can have a calm, reasonable debate without acting like that. Like, this was supposed to be that opportunity. And he sort of dropped that ball. And he did later on his YouTube channel apologize for that. So I think that was the biggest failing of it, and what made the whole debate go off the rails. So it's pretty much a useless debate to watch because we don't get anywhere hardly in the whole debate.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem that I actually have. I actually made a video criticizing, Sargon in that aspect, but I ended up taking it down, one, because it was a different format than what I usually put on my YouTube channel, but two, I did see that he tried. I guess you would call it an apology or saying that he didn't feel right about it. So I was like, okay, I'll give the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he felt like to me, it felt like he was just trying to grandstand and trying to get the audience riled up. I feel like most debates are more about like who's the loudest and the cockiest, and not really about the substance of the information. I think that's what made it sad. It's not like we're sitting here on Facebook or YouTube arguing with each other. This is a debate where we're trying to understand ideas. And then even in the atheist or skeptic community, where we're supposed to be on the forefront of critical thinking, and that just didn't seem like that's what was happening.
Yeah, I agree. No, I totally agree. And you're right about debates generally. I'm good at debates. That's why I'll do any debate that people will hire me to do if it's a field that I know, that I actually can defend the proposition and whatever it is. Because I have the skill at it, and I do. Debates draw in larger audiences than lectures do. So you can reach a wider audience, especially an audience that wouldn't normally hear what you have to say. But they do tend to become these rhetorical competitions rather than a genuine search for the truth. And so that's the thing I don't like about debates. And so I just don't like debates generally, usually. There have been some exceptions throughout my career, but generally they are this sort of, it's all about game, it's all about winning before the clock runs out and that kind of thing, which I really don't like. I treat debates as an opportunity for education. Like, my goal is not necessarily to win. Obviously, I do whatever technically I can to rebut the arguments presented. But the goal for me in any debate, and this is when I'm debating Christians, doesn't matter who or what I'm debating, is to educate the audience. I want them to hear things and think about things that they haven't heard before or haven't thought about before, so that if they are critical thinkers at all, or anyone who has cognitive dissonance when they hear these things and go, wait a minute, like, I wasn't told that, or I didn't think that before, that they will then, after the debate themselves, go look into these things further and eventually come out. And this is, I've been debating for almost 20 years now, and I've had many ex-Christians come up to me as atheists and say, hey, it was that debate, we'll pick some debate that they saw years ago, that started me on my path to getting out of Christianity. And so I know it's a small percentage, but it does have that effect. You're reaching more people, and the people who are thoughtful are going to get out eventually on their own. It's not like that one debate is going to convince them of anything, but it'll get them to thinking. And that's what I see debates as. And I was treating the Sargon debate as a similar one. I didn't think I was going to change Sargon's mind. Right. The other thing is that usually when you're in a debate, the person who's debating you is so dug in and so committed, you're never going to change their mind usually. Right. But you can change the mind of audience members who haven't really thought through the things as much. They haven't built this rationalization wall to defend their delusion yet, or they are critical thinkers and just not sure. You will reach many audience members that way. So I do find debates valuable in that sense. But you're right, there is this tendency to make them all about game and grandstanding and rhetoric and tactics and stuff. And those are things that I don't like about debates generally.
And that is the one thing that I did love about debates. It was one of the things that got me to change my mind about a lot of my positions was watching debates. A good debate, even though you're right, it won't change the person you're trying to debate's mind. Listening to it, you hear both sides of the arguments enough to say, okay, even if you're confident in the position that you have, I know we get into these shit debates on Facebook and YouTube. I don't count those debates. I count as just shit shows that we have. But I'm talking about an actual formal debate where people are generally trying to sit down and have an intellectual conversation. You really gain something from it. But I think people that watch this can see through people that straw man people, or just set up something to make themselves look good. And I feel like it doesn't add anything to intellectualism when you do it. So
yeah, I agree. It's very much true. The best debates that I've had, like I did 2 debates with Christian apologist Michael Licona. And the second debate we did, it started out with a standard combative podium presentation opposition. But the rest of the debate we had planned in advance would be just us sitting in chairs. It was just like the Sargon debate in format, basically. But our goal, we both agreed that our goal was to understand why the other person believed what they did. Rather than to win, quote unquote, it was to try and understand the other perspective. And that actually produced a much more interesting exchange between us that I thought was much more profitable and made progress than any other debate I had done on that subject before. And I was kind of hoping that the Sargon debate would be something like that. It just didn't turn out that way.
You know, it's sad. You know, let me ask you a question really quick, because you're talking about debating. How do you prepare for a debate when you're getting into doing it? How much research do you do? How do you formulate what you're going to be saying and doing in an actual debate?
It depends on who I'm debating and what the subject is. Some things I already know everything. So, there's not really anything new. Like if it's the resurrection of Jesus, I've heard every argument. I've researched every item. I've written, on everything. So I don't generally have to review stuff for that. So that I already have down, for example. That's a subject I've got. But what I will do is I will sometimes study the person I'm debating. See what types of arguments do they use? What types of tactics do they use? What should I be extra prepared for? What kinds of examples should I have queued up? Like sometimes I can't remember everything at the podium. So if there's which things should I prep for that particular person? And sometimes like I don't know going in, like even what they're going to do. The debate I just had in November, it was November in Dallas or Houston, sorry, with this McDermott, who's this strange biblical libertarian. I wrote an article about this debate, but the debate point was not going to be did God exist? It was going to be which worldview is better for the world, naturalism, atheistic naturalism, or Christian theism. And so I hadn't done a stand-up formal debate like that on that subject before. So that was like, wow, I'm not entirely sure. That could go on to any millions of subjects. Who knows what it's going to be? So I actually, on the car ride out there, because I was doing a tour at the same time, I just had text-to-speech his blogs. So I just listened to his blogs. And so got a sense of what kinds of things he advocates, what kinds of arguments he makes. And so that was how I prepared for that debate. In the Sargon case, I prepared for things that I knew were going to come up because of previous interactions with Sargon. But I didn't really have to study tons of his videos because I wanted him to be able to present position rather than have to. I mean, I had an idea of trying to go back to some of his videos in the debate, but I gave up that idea because it was too difficult to try and convey that to the audience because they won't have seen necessarily certain videos. I think there's certain videos that really illustrate problems with Sargon's critical thinking. So I could have done a presentation on that, but it wasn't going to work for the kind of debate format I was hoping we would have. So I didn't do that. So I just wanted him to state his case there in the chair, and then we could have a reasonable, hopefully, was my idea, to have a reasonable conversation about, well, why does he think that's true? Or has he considered these other things? And what does he think about these other things? And so on. It just didn't go that way. So it was me just trying to handle this new tactic of bullying and not listening to me and things like so. I had to basically sort of manage the debate rather than actually accomplish anything, and that was frustrating.
Well, I thought it was a super important topic, so maybe we can dive into it just a little bit. I mean, the topic is social justice and intersecting with atheism, and if we're going to be, I don't want to say putting a new set of rules. I hate the word, but creating new ways of dealing with social justice without religion. And I think this is going to be an important part of how do we do that. So maybe just a little bit. Maybe if people didn't watch it, or I recommend people go watch it, even though they'll probably pull their hair out about it. But I still think that the topic is super important. So real quick, how would you define social justice then? What's the framework we're working around when we're talking about a subject like this?
Yeah, so generally social justice means all the justice that we can't accomplish in courts. So you can have all the laws you want, you can have all the court system you want, but that's not by itself going to create a just society. There's going to be a lot of inequalities and injustices in society left over. So how do you deal with those things? You can't legislate them most of the time. Some of them are legislative issues. Abortion access can become a legislative issue, but you have these things where you have certain states, for example, create legislation that make it exceedingly difficult to have access to abortion, so that it's technically legal, right? You technically have the right, but they've made it almost impossible to get access to it. So that's an example of a social justice issue. There are legislative solutions to that, but they're also just, you need social awareness, first of all, for people to even know that this is happening, that there are states in this country where it's effectively impossible to get an abortion. And so if you're pro-choice, you should be concerned about that. And if you don't, you won't know this, and someone doesn't tell you that this is a problem, and then kind of figure out ways, how do we solve this problem? That's just one example of a million you could come up with. Some are issues of attitude and expectation. They're cultural issues where the culture has to change. And culture can't be legislated. You have to change it through persuasion, through awareness, through education. And so a lot of social justice activism is just informing people of things. Certainly the good social justice activism, the best stuff, especially done by professionals who write some of the best works. I think this came up in this debate with Sargon, which is, how do you deal with racism? And he made some points about how, like, certain ways that social justice activists deal with that is unproductive or even counterproductive, and I agreed with that. But he's looking at amateur YouTube activists. He's not looking at actual professionals who are writing books, peer-reviewed books about how do we deal with racism, who are writing articles for professional organizations, for the public, like, this is how we deal with racism. It's much more nuanced and smarter, basically, and it's more based on our understanding of what actually does affect change, rather than just ignoring what affects change and just getting angry on the internet, which is not an effective tactic by itself.
Are you sure? Because everybody seems to do it. They seem to think it's effective. I don't know, but
that's the thing, is they don't look at, like, so. To Persuasion, and all the writers, the professional writers on reducing racism in society, point this out. That's been talked about. I brought up one of these books in my debate with Sargon too, which is, and I talked about it on my blog, so people who want to go find it, it's there. Is this fact that if you want to change someone's mind, especially if they are locked in, the worst kind of bigotry, the most common kind, is unconscious. Like, people are not. You have racists who are like, yeah, the black people are inferior, let's get rid of them. But then you have people who don't think that. Like, they don't have these conscious beliefs, but they do have innate biases that they're not controlling for. And that's just one bias among many. We have lots of cognitive biases. You could go to Wikipedia and look up the list of cognitive biases, and there's tons of them. Lots of ways that our brain misinterprets reality, and a lot of them are not loaded politically. Like, for example, there's the bias where we mistake sensationalism with frequency. So a classic example is when school shootings started ramping up in the late 90s, the belief was that violence in schools was getting out of hand. When in reality, you look at the statistics, violence was declining substantially, and actually still is in public schools. It's just you have these few really spectacular, highly publicized tragic events, these mass shootings, and that's happening even now again. And that's actually does not reflect the actual statistical reality. And so people have this, their bias is that, oh, this must be happening all the time. Violence must be getting worse in schools everywhere. And that's not the case. So that's not politically loaded. It's not based on racism or sexism or anything like that. But that's an example of how the brain is malfunctioning, and you have to compensate for this because the brain is evolved to make this mistake. It's built in. That's one of the ways that your brain figured out to sort of guess at what's frequent is to see what is most prominent. Now, it's okay as a heuristic, but it actually is not a reliable method. It's going to misfire a lot. And so the same with racism or sexism. You might have this culturally installed software in you that's making you think and believe and act in certain ways. You might not even be aware of it, but you can only get out of it if you're aware of it and control for it. And so there are aspects like that. And the key thing is when you're dealing with that kind of racism, the only way you're going to succeed at it, and this is also true if you're arguing against religion, people who have religion, they need their religion for certain things. And certain people need their political beliefs for certain things. Politics is like a religion in that sense, and it has its own mythology and everything. If you want to reach them, you have to actually understand them, right? You can't just walk in and just call them racist and try to shame them or whatever. You've got to actually understand, well, why do you have these beliefs? What beliefs do you actually have? Let me understand your situation. And so these like professional anti-racist activists talk about how you actually got to talk to people who are struggling. What are their actual concerns that is actually fueling their racist reactions? You want to understand Trump voters, you've got to actually talk to Trump voters and see what actually are. Now, they might have tons of false beliefs. They might have delusions and so on. But you want to get at why is that, and you want to find a common ground, something that you share with them. And that's your way in if you're going to persuade someone, is that you actually say, okay, we share some common values here, some common ideas here. I understand what you're talking about. I get it. Let's I understand you have these problems. Let's talk about how to solve those problems. Let's talk about the evidence and stuff, rather than going right at their racism or what their assumptions are. Like if they're blaming immigration for all their problems, for example, is like, well, that means there's problems. Right. Let's talk about those problems. Immigration is not really going to end up being the cause of their problems.
Right.
So you have to go around it that way. And so there's a lot of these tactics. We understand how to change the world for the better. There is this idea of how to have effective social justice activism. And the amateur YouTubers and interneters don't study this stuff, don't listen to it, and won't listen to it even when you tell them there's all this published science that's telling them how to do this better. They don't care. And I think that's an example of a criticism of the left, how the left behaves. They ignore the science that's telling them how to do their job better and promote their views better. The conservatives do this too. They ignore the science, unless they're doing marketing. Then they love the science. But
so where do you draw the line when it comes to that? Because I mean, obviously, I agree with you. Because I mean, I made in my documentary film Reasons to Believe, I tried to show that you had to find, that middle ground with people. You had to be able to find the rationality. But I've also tend to find that there's a lot of people that really don't give a shit of even finding the middle ground with you. And so I don't rule out all people. And I always say you should try to learn another person's argument. But there's some people that I don't think I'm ever going to change their mind. I can't say that ever.
That's true. I agree.
Like the Alex Jones. So where do you draw that line?
It's hard to do. I mean, I only know in hindsight from almost 2 decades of seeing the effect of changing minds. So I know it happens. Yeah. But how do you tell in advance that okay, this person is worth my time and this person is not? Now, you might not be able to. And my solution to that is to not argue in private most of the time, unless I have a specific reason I need to talk to this one person. Arguing with one person, like in a private chat room or something, is not worth my time unless I have a specific reason why I need to engage with that person. It's not worth my time. If it's better to do it in front of a bunch of people, have an audience, because the statistical chance that you will change a mind for the better and thus contribute to improving society for the better goes up the more people who are listening in and watching that conversation. So that's why this is the tactic that I adopted long before I got involved in this stuff, back when I was, and still do, debate Christians. It's the same idea. Like, why argue this point with this Christian in a private message thing? I'm not going to change this Christian's mind. They're a fanatic. I can tell they're a fanatic. But if I'm arguing with them in front of a bunch of Christians, that's when I start, a year, 2 years later, some of those Christians who are listening in come to me and say, you know what, you were right. And so that's one of my solutions for that, is rather than try to predict whose mind you can change, have a lot of people listen in on what the conversation is. And when I'm debating someone, my goal is not to change the mind of the person I'm debating. My goal is to influence the audience, to educate them and get them thinking for themselves, so that they can find their path. And so I think that's the solution generally. I mean, obviously it comes a point when you're arguing with someone, you realize that they are just immovable. There's nothing you can do to change them.
And you got to kind of be able to weigh it out. Say, am I wasting my time? Is this worth still pursuing?
Correct.
And you never do really know. And you don't know. Like you said, I like when you can do it publicly where other people see it, because you're more likely to say, well, this person, a third party is probably more likely to be less involved or worry about being wrong or whatever if they're just objectively looking at it sometimes. So. I got a quick question here on Facebook real quick from Caleb Allen Titman. Says, how do you combat apologetics that thrive on epistemic uncertainty or epistemic he said it twice, sorry. How do you combat apologetics that thrive on epistemic uncertainty? Did I say that right?
I'm not sure what they mean, unless they're talking about things like skeptical theism. No, I actually can't answer that unless I know specifically what they mean. If they're talking about skeptical theism, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. A particular apologetic tactic, which is to say, I mean, basically the whole basis of skeptical theism is the fallacy, what I call the possibilitor fallacies, which is if it's possible, therefore it's probable. Well, let's say it's possible there are all these excuses God has for being a no-show and doesn't care about justice or anything of that stuff, that he doesn't act, doesn't do anything, doesn't say anything. It's possible he has all these reasons that are completely justifiable and we just can't think of them. But that doesn't make it probable. It's this leap from what's possible to what's probable that is the fallacy there. And so if you deal with anyone who's trying to argue from a point of like, well, we don't know, therefore anything is possible, your conclusion has to be, well, okay, but what is probable then, given what we know? That's the thing that only matters. And what do we do with that information? So I bypass this sort of doubt justifies all things kinds of reasoning through that mode of response.
Okay. Do you feel that right now with with what we're doing right now in the atheist and skeptic community, I want to turn this a little bit into a direction where I'm starting to feel. I had this conversation with somebody before about this, about how I'm starting to feel a little bit frustrated with the atheist and skeptic community. Do you feel like the movement that we're doing with what we're talking about even right now, trying to get people to think critically and change their minds, here's what I mean. Most of the time I watch people like you and other people out there really trying to give really good intellectual arguments, working really hard to try to get out there and spread a message of thinking and reasoning and rationality. And I feel like we're kind of backpedaling into some other area with atheism, or it's going somewhere, or I don't know if it's still effective as it was many years ago. What do you feel is the state of atheism now?
I don't know. I think what I've noticed is there's an increasing disinclination to fund it. So the donors are hard to find now. I think there's a growing assumption that we don't need organized atheism anymore. The organizations that are still getting funding are the ones that just do legal activism work, like FFRF, or the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And even that's sort of dying out. I mean, they're doing fine, but the mission is shrinking. Like, there's fewer and fewer occasions where we need to fight for atheist rights in court. They still exist, but it's fewer and fewer. It's not like it was in the 80s and the 90s. And so the question then is like, well, what do we do? Now, you have a lot of the liberals in cities are your most likely target audience, but they live in environments where they aren't impacted by religion all that much. So they think, well, why do we need organized atheism? And then you have the groups in the South that say, we really need atheism, organized atheism, because we're beleaguered by these religious communities. But because they're mostly rural, they're spread out, and so they can't organize. Like, it costs too much in time and resources for them to get together, basically. So I think that's kind of the growing issue that's going on, and it's difficult trying to figure out, well, what will draw audience now? If you want to have a big conference, for instance, I don't know what the answers are. I don't know what the resolution is going to be long term.
What do you think about the splintering of the atheist community in itself? I think that's the thing that concerns me. Is I feel like we've focused more on, even a lot of them going to the anti-social justice, and believe me, I've criticized, the social justice warriors that are actually causing problems, but not the actual people with social justice. Going back to even the conversation you were having, I think we've already accepted that there's this, fringe of people that are messing it up, but there's still important issues. And especially as skeptics, we're trying to think about, well, how do we solve these problems? Do you feel like politics has divided our community? Do you think we're taking the same effort to really understand, these serious political situations as we do trying to criticize religion? Or do you feel like we're just splintering in a bunch of different groups like most communities out there?
I think it's a microcosm of society, right? So what's happening in atheism is happening everywhere. It's not just atheism. And when you're doing anything so you can have a thing like model train society, where your focus is on model trains, and that's usually not going to get political. Whereas atheism is inherently political. You can't avoid the political reality, because atheists are saying the world will be better without religion. That is a political statement. And that means, well, how is it going to be better without religion? Of course, the religious come back and say, no, if we get rid of religion, everything is permitted. There's no, everything is fine. And then you're going to have chaos, because there's no morality. There's no rules. There's no whatever. I mean, it's a bogus argument, but that is their argument. Atheists have to have a response to that. Like, how are we going to make the world better? Like, if we don't have an answer to that, then we basically lost the argument with the religious, who are saying, oh, well, then we need religion. So atheists do have to answer that question, and that becomes a political. You can't avoid the political answer in that. It's cultural too. So there's the politics of culture and the politics of legislation are two different aspects of our political reality. You can't avoid it. So atheism is inherently political. The other side of this is that atheists have been so angrily focused on religion that they are blind to the same problems in anything else that is not religion related. So to give you an example, when I'm arguing with people like Sargon or anyone who's anti-social justice or anti-feminist, they throw at me all the exact same fallacies of reasoning that I run into with Christian apologists. In fact, I could do like a chart where it's like they're basically the exact same person. It's just one has chosen Christianity and the other has chosen this political ideology to defend with all this fallacious reasoning. And all the things that they would argue against a creationist, for example, all the things they would laugh at about a creationist, they're doing. Mm-hmm. So they're actually doing exactly the same things. Quote mining, like you could pick any tactic. They do it. And they're blind to the fact that they're just becoming their own enemy. They're becoming the thing that they were opposed all this time because they were so focused on the ideas they were trying to rebut rather than on the methods that led to those ideas and they're necessary to rebut and get rid of those ideas. If they'd focused on the critical thinking alone and applied it to everything, then we wouldn't have this problem. We could actually have like reasonable debates between conservatives and liberals within atheism. We could actually find common ground and work together if we were all critical thinkers. And I think the biggest problem with atheism is hardly any atheists are actually critical thinkers. They're just anti-religious.
Right.
And that becomes a problem, particularly when your organization or your membership, let's say that your subgroup or whatever, when the population gets large enough. And that's what's happened. I think atheism has become popular. We've basically won part of that argument is that atheism is super popular now. There's tons of atheists. You look at the statistics, the younger generation, bam, lots of them now are atheists, or at least some version of non-believer, or some version of skeptic of religion. So their numbers are huge. And then, of course, that's leading to this problem. If you haven't armed them to be critical thinkers about everything, then the organization is just too large and it's going to splinter and fall apart.
Yeah, I say that all the time. Just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you're a critical thinker. I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up because I talk about that with my wife all the time. I'm like, just because you don't believe something doesn't mean that you don't make errors. And I do notice that now. Like, one of the things I noticed was how I saw the errors of thinking, which goes to show that this is a human problem. Like, people think, oh, well,
yeah,
it's just religious people. I'm like, no, this is a human problem. I mean, we can take the ideology of religion.
Yeah, I got to make the point, too, that I see exactly the same thing on the left. So it's not like I'm criticizing conservatives or anti-feminists specifically. Feminists do the exact same things as well. So it's like I could point out all the same tactics that they're doing. So it like you said, it's a human thing. It's not a particular thing attached to a religion or an ideology. This is a human problem, and I think a lot of people, their egos prevent them from recognizing it as an issue. But continue. You were going to make a point.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. And I think the reason why I'm a little bit harder on our community is because we advocate for critical thinking. So it's like we should be even more like more prone to exercise that thing more than other groups. I'm not saying other groups don't use critical thinking. I'm just saying one of our platforms is to say rationality and critical thinking. So I think we need to put a little bit more pressure on not pressure, but just have more of a standard for ourselves into doing that. But, I don't want to make a bunch of arbitrary rules for groups and whatever. And then it's one of the reasons why we left religion in the first place,
Right.
But it's still important, I think. So.
Yeah, I agree. And that is challenging is how do you establish common norms without just trying to dictate how people should behave altogether, right? So obviously there have to be some sort of baseline norms for anyone to get along at all.
Yeah.
But there's this tendency then to try and force more and more norms on people. And like I said, you see that on the right and the left, within atheism and without atheism. There's this tendency to try and go towards more and more purity politics. You've got to be more and more like us or you're evil, right? Rather than saying, okay, there's certain core things we can agree on. There's certain other things, everything else we can disagree on, even vehemently, but we can still work together on the basis of these core values. That kind of reasoning in and of itself is a form of critical thinking, and it's a form that's frequently abandoned in social groups.
So how do you go about addressing norms? And let's talk about that for a minute, because one of the things we're trying to do when we're addressing, especially in the religious community, is probably norms that have been around for hundreds, thousands of years. And now that we are challenging religious-based norms, we now realize that either they aren't true or they're just not really a part of a real norm. For example, and one of the things we were talking about earlier, we're talking about marriage. One of the things that's held sacredly to religious people is marriage, and marriage between one man and one woman and stuff. So maybe we could talk a little bit about polyamory. I mean, how do you address something as crucial as people that have these long-held beliefs about marriage between one man and one woman, and then now we're moving into a secular environment where we're trying to explore ideas, but they're so against this norm that's out there when it comes to people?
Yeah, that's actually a good segue because it ties into just what we were just saying. So for those who don't know, I'm openly polyamorous, so I'm an advocate for ethical non-monogamy, and I've written about this too. You can find it on my blog at richardcarrier.info. But one thing I've noticed there is a whole monogamy culture and a sort of monogamy mindset, sort of system of beliefs and mythologies that I find very similar to religion, and I've written about this too. Like I find that when I'm arguing with people about monogamy, I run into all the same arguments and fallacies and stuff, and that I see with religious people that I argue with. There's a lot of similarities, including, like, for example, control behaviors. So I have to digress a little bit on this to go back to Christianity. I wrote an article on Randall Rouser's book, Is the Atheist My Neighbor? And Randall Rouser is this Christian apologist who tries to bring his mission to atheists. And so he's one who actually follows the science and says, okay, I got to understand atheists before I can persuade them. And he actually has a better understanding of why an atheist believes what they do and so on. And he wrote this book called Is the Atheist My Neighbor? In which he argues that Christians need to stop using the atheism as a fool trope. Like God is not dead, or the Bible where it says only the fool has said in his heart there's no God. He gives examples of this trope being used and completely annihilates it both theologically, so even from a Christian perspective, but also just methodologically. This is bad. This is both based on false beliefs about atheists, and it's also bad for the mission of spreading the belief in Christ. And so it's actually a really good book in that regard. It's he has a really good breakdown of this is why Christians need to stop doing this and need to treat atheists with more respect. And of course, in one of when he gets to the end of the book, he has these recommendations for what Christians and churches should do, and a lot of them are about you should invite atheists into your fellowship, and you should work with them on soup kitchens, and you should, treat them with respect, and so on. And what I wrote about in my blog is there's a reason why that will never happen, and I think what he misses is he sees it as just false belief or as bigotry. He talks about it's anti-atheist bigotry. He describes it. And I said, I don't think, sure, that's probably part of it. But I think the main thing that's going on here is that all these tropes are not actually aimed at atheists. They're aimed at fellow Christians. So if you think of only the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. They're not talking to atheists. They're trying to tell Christians that, if you start to doubt, you are a fool. So that's actually a control doctrine. It's meant to keep people in the faith. And so all this demonization of atheists, atheism leads to depression, that false trope. That's meant to scare Christians into not considering atheism. It's not meant to convert atheists to Christianity. And so that's why churches will never do this fellowshipping with atheists. And because I've seen it happen. They'll do it and then it stops. Because as soon as that starts happening, as soon as you start saying atheists are respectable, people in your congregation are going to go, atheism is respectable? I can be an atheist? Mm-hmm. And okay. Right. There's no way this works out for the churches, right? So they're going to hemorrhage more people. If you allow that to be a respectable position, if you allow, they're respectable, they're not fools, they're intelligent, they're good people, you can work with them on great social causes, the congregations go, well, then why do I even need to be a Christian? And so that's the problem. That's why they have to demonize atheists, is to keep Christians Christian. And I find the exact same kinds of arguments in defense of monogamy. A lot of monogamy-based argumentation or attitudes and behaviors are meant to keep people monogamous, right? Because there's this fear that if all these fears of what's going to happen if people start advocating ethical non-monogamy, particularly if you're locked in a monogamous relationship. Now you're worried about losing your partner or whatever it is. You're worried about having to deal with this jealousy and so on. So and these mythologies develop of what polyamorous people are like or what non-monogamy will lead to. A lot of pushing on the whole point of, you just be jealous all the time. And it's in reality, no, that actually isn't the case. And so this creates a lot of problems in dealing with monogamy culture defenses. It is based on a lot of false beliefs, and they're often built and targeted to keep people monogamous. And this stuff survives religion. It stays in secularism. We've had this, marriage used to be about owning women. It was about property, controlling the womb. It was all about owning the womb. And now that we've repudiated that we don't accept that culturally anymore. What is it about? It's about romantic love. So that we recreated this defense of monogamy simply because it was traditionally what was there. And it leads to too much upsetting of the apple cart, as it were, if we were to start questioning that. But it's already happening, and polyamory is becoming more public and more known. The option is more available, and that's kind of what happened to me. For most of my life, I was monogamously married. I didn't know that ethical non-monogamy was a realistic option. But when I started to discover that it was, that's what led to my realizing that I couldn't be monogamous anymore, and that there actually was an opportunity to do this. It would have been better had I known that before getting married. And I think I always tell people, try polyamory first. Then if you want to be monogamous, then you know, and then you can go and be monogamous. But if you go monogamy first, you're going to get stuck in it. you're not going to be able. There's no easy way out of it once you've done it. So it's better to try poly first. That's what I say.
So how do you deal with because you brought it up a little bit. How do you deal with the jealousy part of that? I'm happily in a monogamous relationship right now, but before I kind of wasn't. But it wasn't the same thing because obviously before I was lying about it, which is important. I think there's a difference between people saying, "Oh, I'm going to just go around and cheat on people," but people that are agreeing to it. So I can't say I was in a polyamorous relationship, but I considered it that. But anyways, how do you deal with that with jealousy? Because I think that's an important thing. I think people feel insecure. How do you deal with the actual jealousy part of it?
It's interesting you point that distinction is important too. The ethical versus not unethical non-monogamy. Once you include both kinds, the reality is humanity is very clearly non-monogamous. Once you include unethical non-monogamy, most people are non-monogamous ultimately, and also especially if you include serial monogamy, because really it shows that we aren't really monogamous. We just have these rules that say, well, if you're going to go for someone else, you're supposed to ditch the person you're with. But that's just a cultural rule. A lot of people break it. And so it's clear that we are not inherently a monogamous species. And so it's such a question of how does our culture construct a system that actually works with what we really are like and makes it so that everybody can be happy, or most people can be happy given the circumstances. And that's why I think ethical non-monogamy is the way forward. But with your question of jealousy, I found what we call I don't think jealousy exists as an emotion. I think what we call jealousy is several different emotions that are caused by different things, and people feel them in different degrees. And so one form of this is possessiveness, feeling that you own people. And that's just, you shouldn't. That we really should be. That's a good example of a social justice issue. Is this idea we should advocate and educate and change people's minds about this, that you don't own someone, and so we have this respect for autonomy, and it's not about like someone getting angry when someone plays with one of your toys. Kind of this is childish behavior, and we shouldn't even have that. Then there's envy, which is a completely different thing. Where if you're both non-monogamous, and one of you is getting a lot more action than the other, one could feel envy for the fact that the other person has more partners, for example. And that's more of a relationship issue of dealing with it. We deal with sibling rivalry. We deal with like friends' attention. Like we already have mechanisms for coping with this and working it out and stuff. So that's not even a sexual issue. That's a common social issue that we deal with all the time. Same skills, same solutions. But then there's the last thing, and usually these three things, one of these three things or a combination of them is what you mentioned, which is insecurity. Feeling insecure, and it can be in two senses. One is you could be so dependent on a relationship that you want to monopolize it. And I think that's a little selfish and also not great for you personally as an individual. I think every individual should strive to be as independent a person as they are, or at least to feel like they can be, like that you don't have to depend on a relationship. Relationships are useful. You can benefit from them. You can have a mutually beneficial thing that can help you both and make your lives better. But you shouldn't be so desperately dependent on it that you will do anything, even unethical things, even things that infringe on the other person's happiness to try and keep that. And so I think that has one aspect of it. The other is also personal insecurity. People tie their egos in so much into being desirable as a person, to being the most attractive person in the room, or the toughest person in the room, or whatever it is. There's something that somehow it hurts to realize that you're not all that, right? Is that we're none of us is the best person in the room at everything, and I think that's another area of personal development that would be good for everyone, is to get away from that, to become more secure in who you are in a way that doesn't depend on you being the best at anything, right? So that I am fine with how I look. I don't look like Brad Pitt. That's fine, right? Like I've coped with that. I might not be the best writer. I think I'm a fairly good writer, but I'm not the best writer. There are better writers out there, and so my ego isn't tied up in being the best at it. So I don't have that jealousy or envy over that, and I don't have any insecurity over that. I know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. I know how good and how not good, and I think you have to find a place for yourself when you're in relationships where that's the case too, where you're okay with yourself as a person, and such that if someone doesn't want to be with you, you don't want to be with them. Like you wouldn't want to be with them. Yeah. And that's what I find in polyamory is that I have many girlfriends. They have many boyfriends. We're all with each other, not because we need to be, but because we want to be. And we're with each other not because we're picking the best, but because we're picking people we really like and that we really get along with. And we don't have to have the most beautiful partners. We may have beautiful partners. We may have, merely attractive partners and so on. It doesn't matter. We aren't defining our relationships or pursuing people based on that. Monogamy has this idea that you have one slot to fill. So you've got to have one person that satisfies all your needs in every way because you only get one. In poly, you don't have to have that. You can have multiple partners who satisfy different parts of yourself and work it out that way. And it's a better way of doing it, but it does require working on yourself as a person. I think, as one person said one time, if you want to be good at poly, you have to have your shit together. You have to figure out your own shit first, right. and then poly works well for you. But I say that's true, but I think that's just good in general. Like, even if you're going to be monogamous, I think you should figure your shit out, right?
Yeah,
like I think,
for sure.
Right. So so I think poly in a way forces you to do that, and monogamy in a way kind of creates excuses not to have to do that. And so that's why I find monogamy culture problematic in many ways because of that. Anyway, that's my soapbox on that. So
yeah, no, I think it's an important subject because, for a long time, I actually was advocating for it. And I realized that society has conditioned us to believe, like, I'm not against either one. Like, if whatever works for you is what works for you. And I think that people should accept that or not accept it in the relationship. How do you approach people then in that situation? I mean, does it narrow down the pool of people that you talk to? Do you have to only find polyamorous people? Because, back then, I would talk to people and I would state my feelings about how I am as an individual, but it usually turned off a lot of people. But I felt I was just being honest with who I was. Like, I felt like I was just trying to be transparent. I'm like, hey, this is who I am. But I feel like it turns off people. How do you find that person that's like, oh, well, that's, people are accepting of that?
I'm always above board and totally honest about it. And I wouldn't want to date someone who wasn't aware of that and okay with it. So they're basically, I generally don't date people at a higher level, like an involved relationship, who aren't also non-monogamous. I've dated people who've only been dating me at the time, but they were not like required to and could see whoever else they wanted and so on. But I also have a variety of lovers around the country who are sort of monogamous, but might be between relationships, or they play the field or whatever it is. But they don't identify as poly. They might go monogamous at some point if they find the right person that's suited for them, but they're still comfortable having, basically a sexual, romantic relationship with me on the side. It's because it's fun and, we have a good time together. And that actually is more satisfying to them, because otherwise for single people, sex is so much tied with the relationship ladder. Like, what if you just want to get laid? Like, there are a lot of women who just want to get laid, but don't want it to turn into, oh, now we have to have this relationship thing. Now we're committed or whatever. But at the same time, they don't want guys that treat them like shit. So there's this conundrum. So a lot of women go without sex for a long period of time. They don't want to, but it's because they can't find that they're stuck with two different kinds of guys. Guys who, if they have sex with them, they want more than they want to give. They want more relationship than the women want. Or dudes who are just treat them like shit as objects or whatever, and don't treat them like persons or like friends or anything like that. Those are really the only two kinds of guys they have available. So I do find that there are a lot of women who are actually excited to find guys like me who are neither of those, right. So they can have fun with and also feel comfortable with and know that like I actually like them as a person and enjoy hanging out with them and treat them with the same reciprocity that I would expect in any other relationship. So and see them as equals too. So that, it's, I think if more men just acted that way, a lot more men would get laid, and a lot more women would get laid, and everybody would have better relationships and better friendships.
Stop being a shithead. That's the problem in this. I mean, especially in this Me Too movement, God, yeah. We're seeing all these people, give or take. I'm just saying, just stop being a shithead. Be respectful. That's what it comes down to. And relationships are relationships. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. It takes more involvement and more commitment and something to work out a relationship than it is to, be with somebody. But at the same time, be respectful. Like, I don't know. This is just fucking common sense.
Respectful. Be mature. Be a responsible person. Like, these are the complaints that I find with all my girlfriends. Like, a lot of them have issues with, like, it's hard to find decent monogamous guys because men, for some reason, our culture has educated men up to be shitty partners. And because I hear the same stories over and over again all across the country. So it's clearly a cultural wide thing. It's not like this, just a few bad apples. It's clearly some big problem. Just to pick one example, like when I'm, gallivanting about in my sexual adventures and stuff, I am super fastidious about condom use, right? So I'm like, I'm the first to mention it. I've got them ready, like and I don't complain about it. It's like, no, of course we use condoms. I have met so many women who've complained to me a lot about how guys try to pressure them to go without a condom. And even like the requirements that a woman would set that are very reasonable requirements for when we would go without a condom, the men are annoyed that the women are going through this list of requirements as if they don't understand or care about STDs or anything like that. Right. But they'll say things like, "Oh, trust me." It's like, I can't just trust you. Where are your test results? When was the last time? Do you know what kinds of behaviors have you engaged in since your tests? It's like all of this stuff you've got to know if you want to be a responsible person. Right. So if you're in ethical non-monogamy, and this is the thing I've heard, is that polyamorous guys usually do really well at this, and women actually prefer poly guys because they understand these issues. They understand birth control. They understand STDs. They understand STD risks. They understand what behaviors can lead to which infections to test for, how often to get tested, and to use condoms and proper condom use, like how to actually correctly use a condom. That these are skills that everyone should have, really. But the fact that we're just not teaching men to first of all, like, why are you trying to coerce a woman into not having or having sex without a condom? Why aren't you concerned about STDs is the question I have. Right. And there are circumstances in which you can have safe sex without a condom, but you have to be responsible people to create those circumstances for that to happen. So, and that's just one example. I could give many other things that aren't related to condom use or sex that have to do with simply the category of being a responsible person, like living your life as a responsible person. And I think so many men are not doing that. Right. And that's a huge turnoff to women for obvious reasons, because women are much more at risk for unwanted pregnancy is a risk that women face that men don't. Right. And so I think men slight that, and also don't take STDs as seriously for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to personal responsibility for sure. And that's so. Are you in a relationship to where do you have a primary relationship and then you have like other people, or is it pretty much equal around? Like, and going back to responsibility, if you are in a primary relationship but you still see other people, I think you should have even more responsibility because you don't want to affect the primary person you're with. Are you in a primary relationship truly. And you have others, or is it the same, or do you see people in primary relationships working that out? How's that?
Yeah. I myself am not. I'm practice solo poly. I'm actually pretty close to the relationship anarchy scale of non-monogamous relationship styles. Mm-hmm. So I live alone and have a lot of partners around me. But many of my partners, some of them anyway, do have primaries. So I'm a member of many polycules that are based on a primary relationship. They would prefer to call it usually a core relationship because they don't necessarily prioritize emotions or anything else that way. Certain things are entangled. Obviously, if you're raising kids, that's a thing that you're doing together that has to take priority when the kids take priority. Or if you're both paying a mortgage together, when it has to do with that, then obviously that takes priority. But it's not the relationship that takes priority. It's the certain entanglements that do. And now there are some people who do it that way. The hierarchy, what we call forced hierarchy polyamory, where the primary relationship is supreme, and so like if your partner gets a veto on who you can date and not date, or who you should break up with or whatever, I'm adamantly against that. I think that's a violation of autonomy, and I think that's basically trying to recreate monogamy culture within polyamory, and I don't approve of it, and a lot of poly people don't approve of it. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of discussion in the poly community about how that's actually a bad style to stick with. But there are people that have these de facto primary relationships, and so that happens. And yes, absolutely, they work out like what kinds of arrangements they're going to do, and it's all based on communication and again like responsibility. So I get tested every quarter, and then I communicate to all my partners what my usual level of risk is, so that they know, so they can make decisions. And if there's something has happened that changes that, I let them know before we have sex again. Like if for some reason, like say a condom broke, that's not happened to me, but if it did, I would say like, okay, so this has happened. I get tested on this date, and so I'll know, or whatever. And so like they get to decide whether they want to take the risk of having sex with me with a condom during that period or not. And so it's just you're all informed. You all get to make decisions about risk. You're not hiding risk from people. And so there's other things too. Like you can do condomless relationships. We call them fluid bonded relationships in poly. You can do that, but all your other partners have to know, or your regular partners anyway, should need to know that, or even your one night stands at least should know what your level of risk is in terms of if we use a condom or how recently it was tested and all of that stuff. So there are ways to do this, but it's through communication and informed consent. Basically, everybody should be informed.
Going back to the talking about the religious norms. So how do you explain this lifestyle to people that say, well, marriage is sacred? I mean, we talked a little bit about it, but moving into a new norm, which I think is important, going back to even social justice and skepticism. How do you address this in this new day and age without people freaking the fuck out or being like, "Oh my God, you're just out there to fuck a bunch of people"? Like, how do you make a responsible message to people and explaining your lifestyle to people that may not understand?
It depends on who we're talking about and what their barriers are and whether it's even worth the bother. Like, this is the same with like religion too. Like, I don't sit on an airplane and try to argue religion with every Christian who sits next to me. Normally, like if I'm traveling, I just don't want to be bothered. So it's not always an issue. But if for some reason someone wants to have this conversation with you, or you're open about it and they have concerns, they want to ask about it, or whatever the reason is, you just get used to figuring out like the same communication style you would use with Christians who have concerns about atheism. Is you would just ask them like, what are your concerns? Like, why do you care? And a lot of people will just say, well, I don't care what other people do. But then, of course, they'll have bigotry in their behavior. Like they will treat polyamorous people differently or, in a more bigoted way than they would monogamous people or things like that. So there is bigotry to deal with, and that's a social justice issue. And a lot of people will say they don't care, but really do. But the people who say they do have concerns, and you can ask them what their concerns are, and you can actually talk about, well, this is what the science shows, this is what the evidence shows, this is what my experiences indicate. I think the most important thing is that people, in the absence of information, people invent stuff in their head, right? Or there's this culture that sends some mythology into their head about what things are like. And until they meet someone, and you notice this is true for homosexuality, it's true for atheism. How many occasions have Christians had all these ideas about what atheists are like until they meet an atheist, and then their mind is blown. Like they'll say, well, they're actually a really nice, thoughtful person. All the things that I thought were true about atheists just turned out not to be true once I actually met one and started talking to an atheist about their experiences. Non-monogamy, ethical non-monogamy is the same way. Like you're going to change your mind a lot once you allow actual exposure to real experience and real information come in. If you go out and talk to these people, read their literature, like go learn things about them. That's what I would say to anyone. Anyone who wants to argue against Christianity, anyone who wants to argue against polyamory, and so on. Like you've actually go learn some stuff, talk to some people, figure out why they believe what they do, or what's actually the reality of their lives, rather than just us making assumptions or basing it on mythology.
Yeah, it's not as scary as everybody thinks it is. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Melissa Ritz says female condoms are the bomb. I got a couple.
I have several female partners who've told me the reverse. Actually, they're not as popular. Wow. I make a point of always having them around, but they are, I have to say, under requested. They are not popularly requested, even by women who've used them and know them. So. Nice. So there's mixed views on that. I'd say probably about 1 out of 3 women like female condoms and the others do not. There's a variety of reasons that they give for why they don't like them. But yeah.
No, you're not speaking for all women and trying to be a social justice warrior, are you?
Yeah. Well, I said 1 of 3, so I'm actually allowing both perspectives rather than generalizing. So that's exactly how one should do that.
Well, we're wrapping up on time real quick. I'm going to ask you a question quick about your latest book, The Scientists in the Early Roman Empire. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that book just came out last year or the year before. It's the last book I've done, it probably will do for a while, that's not just going to be a shorter pop market version of things I've already done, where it publishes new original research. It basically reproduces my dissertation from Columbia University 10 years ago. 2 books came out that were based on my dissertation. One was Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, which is all about the education system in the ancient world. up to and including pop culture. Like, how did just ordinary illiterate people who didn't go to school learn things? And so I have a whole education system discussed, and then I emphasize what is the science content of it, of the time. And then the scientist in the early Roman Empire is all the rest of it, which is who were these scientists? How much progress did they make? What did people think about them? What did people think they do? What did they think they do? What did they do? What did they accomplish? I have talk about technology history in there as well as science, and the literary depiction of scientists. I have a little history in there of ancient science and its progress over time, and so on. And then compare and contrast pagan values and attitudes with Christian values and attitudes, and show that you can see why the Middle Ages became very I'd say unscientific, not necessarily anti-scientific, but just unscientific. They lost interest in science because they were hostile to the fundamental values necessary for continuing scientific progress, which were a belief in the value and importance of progress in knowledge, empiricism, where empiricism trumps all other authority, and curiosity, that being curious and wanting to know the answers to things is valuable. Christians were actually against these things. They hadn't linked them to science. They were just against them generally. But once you have a culture that's against these things, that culture is not going to be too enthusiastic about continuing proper science. And so they didn't. We had cessation of scientific progress for 1,000 years once Christianity took over. So eventually some Christians regained enthusiasm for these pagan values and started spreading them again, trying to transform Christianity, basically repaganize it in a way. So that happened, but it did put us on stall for 1,000 years. We could probably be 1,000 years more scientifically advanced today had that not happened.
That's scary.
But if you want to understand the background to that, how that came to be for the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, that's my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. So people who are interested in this subject, want to really get the truth about ancient science. There's so much science they accomplished that you probably have never heard of. You haven't been told the truth, I'll tell you, or get highly informed about how much they did, how close they got to a scientific revolution. And my book covers all of that.
And we'll have the links in the description below. And if we want to send people to your website, again, what's your website and maybe your Twitter, Instagram? And I'll have all these links again wherever you guys are listening. I'll have all the links to his book and his website and everything here. But
yeah, everything worth following you can get to through my website. So richardcarrier.info. You've got my blog. There's a link where all my books are sold, applications, anything else. So my Patreon you can get to through there, so you can help support my work on my blog. My Facebook, you can follow me on Facebook through their Twitter feed and all of that. Everything is there. And recommendations for books and different subjects. If you want to know what my recommendations are, I've got that. Tons of stuff. So you can just explore the whole website and see what's there.
All right, awesome. And it seems to be never enough time on this show. I need to do a show like Joe Rogan where I go on for 3 hours at some point, because you have such great stuff you're talking about. I want to get more in depth with it, but unfortunately we're running out of time. But Richard, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I really do appreciate it. And make sure you check him out. Yeah,
thanks.
So that's our show for today, guys. Richard Carrier, once again, and check out our the podcast I had with him before is Are Christianity and Jesus a Myth? That was a really great episode. Like I said, it's one of my most popular ones of download and views on that YouTube. And make sure you check all the stuff. Again, I will have all the links in the description below, his website, all his books and stuff like that. So, and if this is your first time on the broadcast today, thank you guys for joining me again. Make sure you make sure you subscribe, and we will be back next week. Peace out.